Usually when we talk about um, a physical injury, right, there's this expectation of visible precision. Like, it's basically engineering.
Right, yeah.
You break your arm, you go to the hospital, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's entirely binary. It's a visible fact.
Exactly. Broken or not broken. It's clean.
And, I mean, we like things to be visible. We want them to be
Oh,
categorized.
absolutely.
We want a distinct, observable cause for our pain because, well, if we can see it, we can treat it.
Right. But then you step into the world of human emotion, specifically, into the experience of loneliness, and suddenly that x-ray machine is it's completely useless.
Totally useless, yeah.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. I mean, how can someone be surrounded by people, living a completely full life, have a supportive family, and still feel just completely disconnected?
That's the great paradox, right?
It really is.
Yeah.
And today we are looking at a framework that treats loneliness not as a feeling to be soothed, but actually as an engineering failure to be diagnosed.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, it's a huge shift. We are diving into Sandeep Chavan's 2026 book, You Are Never Alone, alongside some contextual ties to his broader work, Participation, From Identity to Awareness. And, our mission today for this deep dive is to guide you through Chavan's radical premise, which is that what we call loneliness is it's actually a structural misinterpretation.
Yeah, it's a radical departure from how we normally handle the topic. I mean, Chavan isn't a traditional psychologist, right, or a wellness guru.
Not at all, no.
He is an independent researcher, and his background is actually in physics, engineering, and universal energy dynamics, which he usually shortens to UED.
Right, UED.
And because of that background, he explicitly rejects the conventional self-help model. I mean, he's really not interested in offering sympathy or, motivational quotes about learning to love yourself.
Yeah, there's no live, laugh, love here.
Exactly. He approaches the human mind as a mechanical system operating under pressure.
Which is why his opening in the book is so striking. I mean, he literally writes, "This is not a book written to comfort you. It is written to remove something, a distortion."
Yeah, it really strips away the sentimentality that usually clouds this whole topic.
Yeah.
Because we tend to view loneliness as, well, an emotional condition, right? A sort of tragic state of being.
Like an affliction.
Right. But Chavan's central thesis is that loneliness is actually a conclusion. It's what he calls a fast meaning.
A fast meaning.
Yeah, a fast meaning that the mind generates to stabilize itself when it faces internal pressure or ambiguity or a backlog of unprocessed data.
Okay, a fast meaning. That concept takes a second to digest.
Yeah.
Because it implies the feeling isn't the truth of the situation, right? It's just the brain's hasty attempt to summarize a complex problem.
Exactly. It's a shortcut.
It's like, okay, let's use an analogy. Like when a computer encounters a string of minor, unresolvable coding errors, right? Parsing through each individual error would take a massive amount of processing power. So to protect the system from just entirely crashing, the computer throws up a generic fatal error screen.
Right. The blue screen of death.
Exactly. It's an oversimplification to save bandwidth. And the mind does the exact same thing. It gets overwhelmed by subtle social or emotional signals, and instead of sorting them out, it just throws up the "I am alone" error message.
That structural analogy holds up incredibly well under Chavan's framework. Because the mind, at its core, is a meaning-making machine. And it vastly prefers painful stability over chaotic ambiguity.
Well, that's interesting. Painful stability.
Yeah. I mean, the "I am alone" conclusion is deeply painful, sure, but it is stable. It is a definitive answer to the unease the system is feeling.
Right. It puts a label on the chaos. But, okay, I understand the theory, but I have to push back here a little bit.
Go for it.
Because this can sound a bit dismissive of very real suffering. Let's take an extreme example. Say someone is in solitary confinement, or they've moved to a new city, they work remotely, and they literally haven't spoken to another human being in 3 months.
Right.
That observation of isolation actively damages human biology. I mean, mammals need touch and vocal resonance to regulate their nervous systems.
Right.
You can't just engineer your way out of biological isolation by calling it a narrative.
Yeah.
So how does Chavan reconcile severe physical isolation with this idea that loneliness is just a fast meaning?
Well, it's the necessary question. And to be clear, Chavan does not dismiss the biological reality of social deprivation.
Okay, good.
The lack of social input, the drop in serotonin and oxytocin, that is real data. Your nervous system becoming dysregulated is a factual physical condition.
Observable.
Exactly. What Siobhan argues is that the suffering of loneliness, the existential weight of it, multiplies exponentially when the mind takes that biological data and transmutes it into an identity. He breaks this down into a three-step progression. It goes observation, interpretation, and identification.
Okay, let's trace that progression. Let's use the News City example. The observation is just the raw data, right?
Correct. The observation is simply, my nervous system is receiving low social imprint. Or even just, I have not spoken to someone today.
Just the facts.
Just the physical facts. That is a neutral physical state. The body might be registering a deficit of stimuli, but the observation itself carries no existential weight. It doesn't mean you're doomed.
Right. But then we move to interpretation.
Yeah. And this is where the mind takes that raw data and adds meaning. It says, okay, no one is present, and this means I am fundamentally disconnected from the world.
Wow.
It introduces the concept of a gap, a failure. It takes a temporary state of low input and interprets it as a flaw in the environment or a flaw in the self.
It makes it personal.
Yeah.
And then the trap snaps shut with identification.
Exactly. Identification is where the mind turns that interpretation into a fixed state of being. It goes from, this means disconnection, to, I am alone, I am unlovable, I am a broken node.
Oh, that's heavy.
It is. The biological deficit is the condition, but the existential despair is the conclusion. Siobhan's point is that, yes, you might require a change in environment to address the biological deficit.
You might need to go hug somebody.
Right. But you have to dismantle the structural identification to stop the suffering. Because once you identify as lonely, it becomes the baseline reality through which you view everything else in your life.
It really makes you look back at your own week, and wonder how many times an observation of simple, quiet, or just low energy was hijacked by the mind and turned into this tragic narrative.
Oh, constantly. We do it constantly.
But if loneliness is this fast meaning generated by a system under pressure, we really have to ask where that pressure comes from in the first place.
Right.
I mean, why are our minds throwing up these error messages when we aren't in solitary confinement, when we're just living normal, everyday lives?
That is exactly what Siobhan calls the architecture of experience. And
No.
this is where his systems engineering background really shines, because he traces the origin of this pressure not to massive traumas,
Right, not the big stuff.
not the big stuff, but to what he calls micro loops or incomplete interactions.
See, this is the part that reframes everything for me. The idea that loneliness doesn't start with isolation. It starts with incompletion.
Yes, a micro loop is an interaction that doesn't fully close. And the thing is, we experience dozens of them a day. They are so subtle we usually don't even consciously register them as problems.
Okay, let's ground this for everyone listening.
Yeah.
What does a microloop look like on, say, a standard Tuesday?
Okay, it's the text message you send to a friend. You share something you're genuinely excited about, and 3 hours later, you get a one-word reply. Cool.
I hate that.
Right. It's an expectation of connection met with an incomplete return signal. Or, say you're in a meeting. You have a sharp insight about the project, but the room is tense. Your boss is glaring at the clock, so you just swallow the thought.
That is a highly common one. You suppress an internal state just to maintain external harmony?
Exactly. You prioritize the room over the loop, or, you make a joke to the barista, they don't hear you over the espresso machine, and you walk out feeling a tiny split-second spike of awkwardness.
I've definitely been there.
We all have. And from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, we suppress these micro-emotions because they aren't vital for immediate survival, right? We have to get to work, we have to function in society.
Right, you can't have a breakdown over the barista.
Exactly. But from a systems engineering perspective, each one of those moments is an open loop. It lacked resolution.
And because they aren't dramatic enough to warrant, a therapy session or a major life change, they just hang around.
They create what he calls invisible carryovers. The mind doesn't delete them, it just pushes them to the background. And this leads to the phase Siobhan calls residual buildup.
Residual buildup.
Because these open loops are ignored, they pile up. They create a measurable, actual load on your cognitive bandwidth.
It's like, to borrow a metaphor, instead of a clogged pipe, it feels more like an overcrowded air traffic control tower.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, you have all these planes, the unexpressed thoughts, the minor rejections, the awkward moments, and they're all just circling the airport. You never give them permission to land, so they just stay in a holding pattern. And eventually your radar is completely saturated.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. The air traffic controller, which is your conscious mind, is spending an enormous amount of unseen energy just keeping track of all these circling planes.
It's exhausting.
Extremely. And when a system gets overloaded with this residual buildup, it experiences what Chavan terms the slowing mind, or the collapse of closure
So
cycles.
the system literally starts to lag.
Yes. In his broader work on universal energy dynamics, Chavan points out a fundamental law of systems. A system failing to complete its cycles will inevitably experience lag and friction. So when your cognitive bandwidth is eaten up by circling planes, you lose your natural rhythm to process new experiences. You become sluggish, irritable, and disconnected.
And this is where the mind panics and generates the fast meaning.
Exactly. Because the mind hates the instability of lag. It demands an explanation for why the system feels so heavy and unresponsive.
It needs a reason.
Yes, it bridges the gap between the discomfort of the lag and the need for meaning by writing a script. It looks at the heavy, unresolved internal state and says, I don't belong here. Nobody understands me. I am isolated.
That is just a profound misattribution.
It really is.
You feel terrible because your processing bandwidth is maxed out by unresolved microinteractions. But your brain misinterprets that internal lag as an external reality of isolation.
And then emotional amplification kicks in. Because the narrative, I am isolated, is absolutely terrifying to a social species.
Right.
So it generates anxiety, sadness, and fear. That fear adds more planes to the sky, which creates more load on the air traffic controller, which creates more lag, which reinforces the narrative.
It's a completely self-sustaining loop.
Completely.
So, okay, if we have all these planes circling and the system is lagging, the obvious answer society gives us is to just build a bigger airport, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go out, meet more people, join a club, force yourself to be social. But why does that usually backfire?
That brings us to the danger of adding load to an already failing system.
Right.
Chavan dedicates a significant portion of the book to the concept of presence without connection. He argues that external solutions to loneliness almost always fail because they misdiagnose the problem as an absence of people rather than a failure of processing.
You know, it makes me think of my own life. A few years ago, I was feeling incredibly isolated. So I forced myself to go to this massive, loud New Year's Eve party.
The classic cure.
Right. I thought, I just need to be around people. But I spent an hour trying to shout over the music, feeling more and more alien. And eventually, I just locked myself in the host's bathroom for 45 minutes petting their tabby cat.
I mean, we've all been there in some form.
I went looking for connection and found it with a feline hiding in a bathtub.
But it's a perfect illustration of why the external search fails. You treated loneliness as a void that needed to be filled with positive mass people, noise, activity.
Yeah.
But you were already carrying a massive residual load of open loops. Chavan makes a critical distinction here between mechanical interaction and a live interaction.
So the party was mechanical.
Highly mechanical. Mechanical interaction is characterized by high activity but low resonance. You are performing the social script, you're shouting over the music, you're exchanging data, but the system is just receiving surface-level activity. There is no internal shift.
It's just noise?
Just noise. A live interaction, on the other hand, requires an alignment of attention, presence, and openness. But if your air traffic control tower is already failing, you simply do not have the bandwidth for a live interaction.
Because I was so focused on the noise and, my own feeling of alienation, I couldn't actually be present with anyone there.
Exactly. When you take an obstructed system and throw it into a high-stimulus environment like a party, you aren't fixing the lag. You are just bombarding the radar with more signals.
That sounds like a nightmare for the air traffic controller.
It is! Chavan introduces the concept of non-recognition. This is the phenomenon where genuine connection might actually be offered to you. I mean, someone at the party might have been trying to have a real, alive moment with you, but your internal state prevents it from registering.
You literally lack the processing power to recognize the connection.
The signal bounces off. To use your earlier computer analogy, the server is sending the data, but your hard drive is full, so it rejects the download. The connection doesn't penetrate the system.
And the danger here is what the mind does with that rejection, isn't it? Because I went to the party, I tried, and I ended up in a bathroom with a cat.
Right?
So my mind immediately concluded, see, you were surrounded by 50 people, and you still felt invisible. You truly are fundamentally isolated.
It hardens the narrative. You treated an internal obstruction as an external absence. When the external solution failed, as it was structurally bound to do that, failure proved, the fast meaning your mind had already created.
It's confirmation bias on a systemic level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The distortion reinforces itself. We create an unhealthy dependency on other people to process our internal lag, which is a structural impossibility. Other people can offer presence, but they cannot land your planes for you.
No one can land your planes for you. That's a tough pill to swallow. So we have this internal lag generating a false narrative, and our attempts to fix it externally only make it worse.
Right.
Over time, how does a temporary glitch become a permanent worldview? How does this distortion solidify into what Chavan calls the fog?
The fog is a really crucial concept. It's the phase where the process we've been discussing, the observation, interpretation, narrative formation, and reinforcement, it becomes completely invisible to the person experiencing it. It's the loss of structural visibility.
You forget the code that wrote the program.
Yes.
You forget that "I am lonely" was a conclusion you drew to explain a bandwidth issue, and you just start believing it's the baseline reality of the universe.
Yeah. In the fog, the baseline is no longer neutral. Any ambiguous interaction is automatically interpreted as a rejection.
Well, wow.
If someone doesn't text back, it's not because they are busy, it's because they don't care about you. You begin to see absence where connection actually exists because your perceptual filter is entirely warped by the internal load.
It's like wearing tinted glasses and forgetting you have them on. Everything just looks dark.
Exactly. But this is where Chavan pivots, and it's the pivot that completely reframes the entire discussion.
Right, because he steps away from the psychological mechanics and returns to physics, to universal energy dynamics.
Yes. He unveils what he calls the structural reality of the human field. And his core premise here is uncompromising. He states that true disconnection is a structural impossibility.
Okay, that is a massive claim.
It is.
We need to unpack the how and why of that. I mean, how does he use physics to prove that psychological disconnection is a myth?
Well, Chavan argues that psychology is an emergent property of biology, right? And biology is an emergent property of physics.
Sure, it all stacks up.
In thermodynamics, there is no such thing as an isolated, closed system unless you are talking about the entire universe as a whole. A human being is an open system. We are in a state of continuous, unbroken interaction with our environment.
We are constantly exchanging energy.
Constantly. You are exchanging heat with the room. You are exchanging gases with the atmosphere through your breath.
Right.
You are interacting with the gravitational field. You are processing acoustic data, light waves, kinetic energy. Even in complete physical isolation, like in the solitary confinement example, your body is mapping the acoustics of the room. It's adjusting to the temperature, digesting food, circulating blood.
So physically, we are never not participating in the universe. But how does he translate that physical reality into a psychological one? Because someone can admit they are exchanging oxygen with the room,
Right.
but still say, yeah, but emotionally, I'm completely cut off.
Because Chavan views the mind as the processing mechanism for that physical reality. The mind's fundamental job is to process this continuous interaction. So when the mind generates the narrative, "I am completely disconnected," it is making a statement that violates the fundamental physics of its own existence.
It's a hallucination.
It is a hallucination. The idea of an independent, completely isolated self is what he calls a functional illusion.
A functional illusion, meaning it's a useful shortcut for navigating daily life, like, knowing where your body ends and the doorway begins. But it's not actually how reality operates on a structural level.
Precisely. We use the illusion of the separate self to function. But structurally, we never leave the field of connection. We are always embedded in it as a node in a network. Therefore, what changes when we feel lonely is not the presence of connection, but the width of our awareness.
The width of our awareness.
Yeah. Our awareness narrows under the pressure of the residual buildup.
This requires us to look at the difference between absence and interruption, doesn't it?
It's the most vital distinction in the book. Absence is a static void. If something is absent, it is gone. If loneliness were truly an absence of connection, you would be a separate object floating in a void, completely severed from the network.
Which physics says is impossible.
Exactly. Because physics dictates you are an open system structurally embedded in continuous interaction, connection cannot be absent.
So if it's not an absence, it has to be an interruption.
Yes, an interruption is a dynamic, temporary break in the flow of perception. The connection is there, the interaction is happening, but your conscious experience of it has been interrupted by the bottleneck in your processing bandwidth.
Let's see if I have this. It's not "I am disconnected from the world." It's "I am a node in a network that is temporarily failing to process the data flowing through me."
That is exactly it. You are experiencing localized lag.
Localized lag.
The network itself is fine. Your structural connection to the network is intact. You are just experiencing a bottleneck in your ability to perceive the flow.
That is such a profound shift in perspective. It takes this romanticized existential suffering and just reduces it to a bandwidth issue.
Which sounds unromantic, but
But it's incredibly empowering. If loneliness is an absence, you are a victim. You have to wait for the outside world to provide presence to save you. But if it's an interruption, you have agency. You don't need to acquire anything new, you just need to clear the obstruction.
once you see the difference, the foundation of the identity crumbles. What felt like nothing is there reveals itself as something is there, but my system is currently too overloaded to register it.
So the obvious next question for anyone listening is, how do we clear the obstruction? If we shouldn't force ourselves to go to parties, and we shouldn't treat loneliness like a void to be filled, how do we actually restore the flow?
This brings us to Siobhan's restoration mechanism, and it requires abandoning the instinct to fix the problem.
Which is hard.
Very hard. We have to move from seeking connection to seeing connection, from trying to fix the self to observing the self.
And when we feel pain, our immediate reaction is to fight it or fix it.
But fixing implies something is broken. If you try to aggressively fix your loneliness by repeating positive affirmations or forcing yourself into social situations you don't have the bandwidth for, you are just adding more force, more pressure, and more load to a system that is already overwhelmed.
You're adding more planes to the air traffic control tower.
Precisely.
Right? Telling yourself, I am surrounded by love, I am not lonely, when you feel terrible, is just fighting the reality of your internal lag. It creates more friction.
Instead of fighting, Siobhan introduces the practice of observation without belief.
Okay, how does that work mechanically? It sounds a bit like traditional mindfulness, but knowing Chavan, there's an engineering angle to it.
It is similar to mindfulness, but the goal isn't necessarily, spiritual enlightenment. It's system efficiency. Observation without belief means noticing the mind when it generates the I am alone narrative, but refusing to grant it authority.
You observe the condition, but you don't buy the conclusion.
Yes. You feel the heavy, uncomfortable sensation. You acknowledge the physical reality of it. You might say, the system is experiencing significant lag right now. The mind is generating this narrative of isolation to explain the pressure.
You name it for what it is.
You witness the fast meaning being produced, but you do not identify with it.
You see the fatal error screen, but you realize the computer isn't actually dead. It's just struggling to process.
And when you strip the narrative of its authority, something vital happens. You stop the emotional amplification. You stop the panic. And when the panic stops, you stop adding new load to the system. You stop sending new planes into the sky.
And what happens to the planes that are already circling, the microloops that have built up over days or weeks?
This is what Siobhan calls the practical reset. When you stop fighting, when you stop seeking external distractions to numb the lag, and you just sit and observe the internal obstruction,
Yeah.
you allow the system's natural tendency to clear itself to take over.
Wait, the system clears itself naturally.
Just like the physical body naturally heals a cut if you stop picking at it, the mind naturally processes and closes open loops if you give it the bandwidth to do so.
Wow.
It doesn't require massive effort to untangle the knot. In fact, it requires a cessation of effort. It requires slowing down, sitting with the discomfort, and letting the backlog process. You let the planes land one by one.
It's a huge relief to hear that. I mean, the idea that you don't have to go out and put yourself out there to cure your loneliness. You don't have to be the life of the party.
Yeah.
You literally just have to sit and witness your own mental traffic jam until the data starts flowing again.
And when you connect this back to his broader framework, Siobhan is pointing out that nothing was ever missing. The need to escape loneliness fades when you realize it is just a temporary obstruction of a continuous flow.
Does the feeling ever go away completely, though?
Well, Siobhan is a realist. He acknowledges that you are human, operating in a complex world. You will accumulate new microloops.
It's inevitable.
You will experience new lag. The feeling of loneliness will visit again. But when it does, it loses its existential weight. It no longer carries the authority of ultimate truth. It just becomes a dashboard light telling you that you've accumulated some residue and need to let the system process.
Routine system maintenance instead of a crisis of the soul,
Exactly.
as he writes at the end of the book. You were never alone. There was no absence-only misinterpretation. It really reframes our entire relationship with the world around
It
us.
really does.
We don't have to constantly build bridges to other people. We just have to clear the fog off our own sensors so we can perceive the network we are already embedded in.
It is the shift from identity to awareness. You stop identifying as a lonely, isolated entity, and you become aware of your continuous participation in the physics of reality.
Let's pull all these threads together. We started by looking at loneliness not as a tragic emotional condition, but as a fast meaning, a conclusion generated by a mind under pressure.
Right, and we examine the architecture of that pressure, seeing how unclosed microloops create residual buildup, causing system lag and narrative formation.
We looked at why external solutions fail, understanding that adding high-activity mechanical interactions to an overloaded system just creates non-recognition.
Then we confronted the structural reality that true isolation is physically impossible for an open system. We aren't experiencing absences, we are experiencing a localized interruption of perception.
And we explored how to restore the flow, not by fighting the narrative or forcing connection, but by observing the system without belief and allowing the natural clearing process to close those open loops. It's a completely different way to look at the mechanics of human emotion.
It requires a fundamental rewiring of how we interpret our own internal data.
As we wrap up this exploration, I want to leave everyone listening with a final thought to chew on. Something that pushes Chavan's framework one step further into the philosophical realm.
It's the natural endpoint of this line of inquiry.
If connection is a continuous structural reality, and if your independence from the world is just a functional illusion, then who is the I that feels lonely in the first place?
Right.
What if the very act of trying to define your separate self, the very act of drawing a boundary and saying, this is me inside and that is the world outside, is the exact mechanism that interrupts your connection to everything else? What if the identity of being separate is the only thing creating the feeling of separation?
It is a question that requires no immediate answer, only observation.
Think about that the next time you feel the room go quiet and the lag starts to build. Thank you for joining us on this rigorous look into the architecture of your own mind.
Thank you for participating in the flow.
And remember, the next time you feel that ache, that heavy load of an overloaded system, the room is not empty. You're simply experiencing a pause in the data. Nothing was ever missing, only unseen.